Really interesting. I mean, sadly the pandemic has had an impact on a lot of young people's lives, but those skills and experiences of, that novels are absolutely constant. It's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that. And it's
For more than 25 years, the world has wondered what really happened behind the royal palace doors after the tragic death of Princess Diana. We've heard from Prince Charles, Prince William, and even from close friends who claim to know the truth. But one voice has always remained silent. Prince Edward, the quiet and often overlooked youngest brother of King Charles III. For decades, Edward kept his distance from the chaos surrounding his family, choosing privacy over attention. But now, after years of silence, the once reserved royal has finally spoken out. And what he's revealed about Diana and the royal family's treatment of her has shocked even the most loyal followers of the monarchy. According to sources close to the palace, Edward's words were not polished or filtered by royal advisors. They came straight from the heart, and they painted a picture the monarchy never wanted the world to see. Edward reportedly described Diana as the one person who saw the truth but was never allowed to tell it. He spoke of the tension that grew between her and senior royals, the private family moments the public never saw, and the guilt he still carries for remaining silent when she needed support the most. He admitted that the royal institution's obsession with image and tradition left Diana isolated, and that, deep down, the family knew it. "We were all afraid of her honesty," he allegedly said. "She was too real for the system." Those words have now sparked a storm inside Buckingham Palace, and a wave of public sympathy that shows Diana's legacy is still very much alive. But what else did Prince Edward reveal about his late sister-in-law, and why? Did he choose to break his silence now? Prince Edward has always been known as the quiet one, the brother who avoided scandal, the one who stayed in the background as Charles, Andrew, and even Diana dominated the headlines. But silence does not mean ignorance. While the world was focused on the drama surrounding Diana and Prince Charles, Edward was there, quietly watching, quietly understanding, and as he now admits, quietly regretting that he never did more. Unlike his elder brothers, Edward was never fully comfortable with royal life. Even as a young man, he seemed detached from the stiff formality that defined his family. Where Charles was groomed for duty and Andrew courted fame, Edward longed for normalcy, something that Diana, more than anyone else, seemed to crave too. When Diana joined the family in 1981, Edward was just 17. He saw up close the overwhelming pressure she faced. The palace had expected her to be the perfect royal bride, beautiful, obedient, and silent. But Diana was none of those things. She was kind, emotional, and painfully honest, qualities the monarchy didn't quite know how to handle. Edward often saw her alone at family events, her eyes searching for warmth in a room full of cold smiles. "She had a light about her," he once said privately, "but I could see that light dimming every year." Behind closed doors, Edward witnessed the growing cracks between Diana and Charles. He wasn't one for confrontation, but he could sense the tension long before the tabloids ever printed it. The air was thick, a royal insider recalled. Edward would sit in silence at dinners while the rest of the family pretended everything was fine. What made him different was his empathy. He never judged Diana for her struggles or her emotional outbursts. In fact, Edward seemed to understand her in ways others didn't. He once confided to a friend that Diana reminded him of a bird trapped in a gilded cage, beautiful, adored, but desperate to escape. During her most difficult years, when Diana's marriage was falling apart and her mental health was under attack from both the media and the royal establishment, Edward reportedly tried to reach out. But within the royal circle, even kindness could be seen as betrayal. He wanted to comfort her, one former aide revealed. But there were unspoken rules about taking sides, and so Edward remained silent. When Diana confronted the royal institution publicly, through her interviews, her humanitarian work, and her emotional honesty, Most of the family recoiled. But Edward admired her courage. "She said what the rest of us were too afraid to say," he later admitted. Still, the cost of speaking up was high. Every time Diana revealed a glimpse of the truth, about her loneliness, about Charles's affair, about the coldness of palace life, the royal family closed ranks. Edward watched as his sister-in-law was quietly frozen out, treated like an outsider in the very family she had married into. At one family gathering, according to a close friend, Edward reportedly saw Diana crying alone after a heated argument with Charles. He wanted to go to her, to tell her she wasn't crazy, that she was right to feel trapped, but the fear of disobedience held him back. "We were all bound by duty," he later confessed, "and that duty sometimes made us cruel." When Diana died in 1997, Edward's quiet world shattered. He saw the crowds of mourners, the oceans of flowers, the tears of millions, and realized how deeply she had touched the public in ways the royal family never could. "We didn't understand her when she was here," he said years later. But the world did. In the years that followed, Edward withdrew even further from royal life. He devoted himself to his wife Sophie and their children, living a life far from the palace drama. Yet according to insiders, Diana's memory never left him. He carried guilt, not for anything he said, but for everything he didn't. And now, after years of silence, that guilt has finally turned into truth. Prince Edward is breaking his silence, not to attack, but to admit, to acknowledge what many have long suspected, that the royal family failed Diana, and that he, too, was part of that failure. But what exactly did Edward reveal about those final years, and the dark truths that were kept hidden from the world? From the outside, the royal family looked perfect. Regal smiles, polished ceremonies, and carefully choreographed appearances. But Prince Edward knew the truth. Behind those palace walls, tension ran deeper than anyone dared to admit. And no one bore the weight of that tension more painfully than Princess Diana. Edward had grown up inside that world, a world where emotion was considered weakness and honesty was treated as rebellion. The royal motto was simple: never complain, never explain. It had worked for generations, until Diana came along. She wasn't raised in a palace. She hadn't been trained to hide her feelings behind tradition. Diana felt everything: joy, sorrow, betrayal, and she let the world see it. For Edward, that was both shocking and admirable. She was breaking the unspoken royal code, and for that she paid a terrible price. Edward began noticing the shift early on. At first, the family adored Diana, the perfect bride, the photogenic princess who brought warmth to the stiff monarchy. But as her popularity grew, so did the unease within the royal circle. The public loved Diana more than they loved the institution itself. And that frightened the palace. Edward witnessed the whispers during private dinners, the glances exchanged when her name came up. Senior royals would sigh when her humanitarian work made front-page news. "She's doing it again," they would murmur, as if compassion were a crime. Diana's openness, her emotional nature, the very things that made her beloved around the world, were seen as dangerous behind the palace gates. Edward once described it as a house where truth was never welcome. He saw her pain. At family gatherings, she often looked radiant for the cameras, but the moment they were gone, her shoulders would drop, her expression would change. "She looked like someone pretending to breathe," Edward later admitted to a confidant. He recalled moments that haunted him for years, like the time Diana left a royal dinner early, her eyes red from crying after yet another argument with Charles. Edward followed her to the hallway but stopped short of speaking. "I wanted to tell her I understood," he said softly. "But I didn't. I just watched her walk away." The more Diana spoke out about her unhappiness, her struggles with the press, her feelings of betrayal, the more isolated she became. Behind closed doors, family members accused her of drawing attention to herself. Advisors urged Edward and others to keep distance from her to avoid being seen as sympathetic. It broke him inside. "She wasn't the enemy," he once said. She was the only one brave enough to say what we were all too afraid to. Edward saw the shift in Charles, too. His brother, once composed and dutiful, grew colder, angrier. The affair with Camilla, once whispered about, became an open secret within the family. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. Edward described those years as living, in a play where everyone knew their lines, and no one dared to improvise. He saw how Diana's light dimmed, how the joyful girl who once danced with Pop, stars and hugged AIDS patients in hospitals slowly, transformed into a woman exhausted by scrutiny and betrayal. Edward never forgot the day he overheard her speaking softly to one of her aides, saying, "I just want to be loved, not used." He would later confess that those words replayed in his mind for decades. The final years before her death were especially painful for Edward. He saw how the family, rather than helping her, treated her as a threat to the crown. It was easier to silence her than to understand her, he admitted, but Edward also carried guilt. Guilt for staying quiet while knowing the truth. He didn't defend her in the press, didn't comfort her publicly, didn't risk the wrath of the palace to speak out. In his heart, he knew he should have done more. When Diana died in that Paris tunnel, Edward was among the first to rush to the palace. He later said For years, Edward buried those feelings, choosing duty over confession. But as time passed and the truth refused to die, he began to see that silence was no longer noble. It was cowardice. Now, decades later, his words have finally shattered that silence. His revelation that the monarchy's coldness played a role in Diana's despair has reignited the debate about whether the royals ever truly loved the people's princess. And yet there's more. Edward didn't just talk about Diana's pain. He also hinted at secrets the palace kept after her death. Secrets that could permanently alter how the world views the royal family. When news broke that Princess Diana had died in a car crash in Paris on August 31st, 1997, the world stopped. Millions cried in disbelief, nations went silent, and strangers held each other in the streets. But inside the royal palaces, the atmosphere was something altogether different, heavy, cold, and uncertain. And Prince Edward, then just 33 years old, saw it all unfold from behind the stone walls of Buckingham Palace. For Edward, the shock was immediate, but what followed left him deeply disturbed. The world was grieving, he reportedly said years later. But inside, there was confusion and fear. In those first hours after Diana's death, chaos reigned. The Queen was at Balmoral with Charles and the young princes. Advisors scrambled to control the narrative before the public learned too much. Phones rang constantly, messages flew between officials, and senior royals debated what to do next. Edward stood by, quietly observing the frantic attempts to protect the institution rather than mourn the woman. It wasn't about grief, he would later confide. It was about image. He recalled how aides discussed how to phrase public statements, what words to use, and, most controversially, whether the royal standard flag should be lowered to half-mast over Buckingham Palace. The Queen's refusal to do so immediately caused public outrage, and Edward even then felt something was terribly wrong. "I remember thinking, we're losing her all over again," he said. "She gave everything to this family, and even in death, they couldn't show her compassion." Edward also revealed that there were discussions about how much of the truth should be revealed regarding the events leading up to Diana's death. The official explanation was simple: a tragic accident caused by a drunk driver. But whispers inside the palace told a more complicated story. He heard questions that no one dared ask publicly about whether Diana had been followed that night, whether certain calls had been intercepted, and why key witnesses' statements seemed to vanish or change over time. "There were things we weren't meant to know," Edward said quietly, "and things that were never meant to be spoken of again." Some insiders believe Edward struggled with those secrets for years. He knew the palace's main priority was to protect the crown, even if it meant burying uncomfortable truths. "The institution must survive," one senior aide reportedly said during a private meeting. "Grief must not weaken it," But Edward thought differently. To him, the way the family handled Diana's death was their greatest failure, not just morally, but spiritually. "We forgot that she was family," he said. "We forgot she was a mother, a sister-in-law, a human being." In the days that followed, Edward watched as the public's anger exploded. Thousands of mourners gathered outside Buckingham Palace, demanding to see the royals. When the family finally returned to London, the silence of the crowd spoke louder than words. Edward, standing beside his mother and brothers, later said he felt the full weight of public judgment. "I understood then how much she belonged to them," he confessed, "and how little she ever truly belonged to us." Even after the funeral, when the cameras moved on, Edward could not shake the unease. He knew there were unanswered questions about Diana's fears before her death, about the letter she wrote claiming she felt watched and unprotected. He once confided to a friend that he believed she was telling the truth, that she had sensed danger long before that fatal night. But the palace never wanted to revisit it. "It was as if the past had to be buried with her," Edward said, "and I couldn't live with that." For years he remained silent, bound by loyalty and fear. He carried the guilt of knowing too much and saying too little. Every anniversary of her death brought the same haunting thought. Could more have been done? When Edward finally began to speak, in quiet conversations, in private reflections shared with those he trusted, his words carried both confession and sorrow. He didn't point fingers. He didn't accuse. But he admitted that the royal family's coldness after Diana's death created a wound that may never heal. "She was the people's princess," he said, "but she was also our conscience, and we lost both the night she died." His honesty has reignited questions the monarchy hoped were long buried. Did Diana's death expose cracks in the royal foundation? And has the family truly learned from it? Or simply hidden those cracks behind a polished smile? What Edward revealed next would challenge everything the world thought it knew, not just about Diana's death, but about what her life revealed about the crown itself. For years, Prince Edward lived under the quiet shadow of his family's silence. Every time Diana's name was mentioned, a subtle unease filled the room, the kind that told him some wounds were never meant to heal. But time, as it does, began to strip away the fear. And as he grew older, Edward realized that silence had become its own kind of guilt. In one rare conversation years later, Edward reportedly said, "There comes a moment when silence becomes betrayal, not just to others, but to your own soul." Those who heard him said his tone was neither angry nor bitter. It was weary, the voice of a man who had seen too much and carried it far too long. Edward's memories of Diana were tender, but also painful. He often described her as a soul that refused to be tamed. He admired her for defying royal rules, for daring to hug children with AIDS when others wouldn't, and for walking through minefields when security experts begged her not to. But more than anything, he remembered her laughter. It wasn't just joy, he said. It was rebellion in the shape of a smile. He also remembered how lonely she looked during official dinners, how she would glance around the table, smiling politely, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She knew she was being watched, Edward said. She felt the weight of every glance, every whisper. When Diana died, that loneliness seemed to echo through the entire royal family. Edward had thought time would heal it, but instead it hardened them. "We built walls around our hearts," he said quietly, "and those walls kept the truth out." Over the years, he began to realize that Diana's death had exposed something much deeper than tragedy. It revealed how disconnected the monarchy had become from the very people it claimed to serve. "Diana saw it before any of us did," Edward confessed. She warned that if the family didn't change, it would be consumed by its own traditions. His words weren't an attack. They were a confession, the kind that comes from watching an institution struggle to remain human in a world that no longer worships crowns. By the time Edward began speaking more openly, Britain itself had changed. The younger royals, William, Harry, even Meghan's entry into the family, had reignited conversations about compassion, mental health, and transparency. But Edward, now older and more reflective, believed the monarchy still hadn't faced its greatest truth. The loss of Diana had been more than a tragedy. It had been a warning. She showed us that the world was changing, he said, and we ignored her until it was too late. Those close to him say he still carries that guilt, especially over how the family handled the days after her death. He believed that if they had spoken sooner, mourned more openly, and embraced the people's grief, they might have prevented decades of resentment. But Edward's final confession, the one he made privately to a family friend, hinted at something even darker. "There are things about that night in Paris," he said softly, "that I wish I could forget. Things that don't add up, and I think she knew it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't name names. But those words, quiet, almost whispered, carried a gravity that chilled those who heard them. After that, Edward seemed more at peace, as if simply acknowledging his doubts had lifted a lifelong burden. "I can't change what happened," he said, "but I can refuse to pretend it made sense." In his later years, Edward spoke often about truth, not the kind found in official reports or royal statements, but the human truth that lingers in memory. "Diana made people feel seen," he said, "and that frightened those who prefer to be unseen." Now, as time softens the edges of history, Edward's quiet admissions have taken on new weight. They remind the world that behind every royal title lies a fragile heart, and behind every tragedy, a story still waiting to be told. In the end, he didn't want to expose anyone. He simply wanted to remind people that empathy should never be treated as weakness. "Diana taught us love," he said. "We should have listened." And perhaps that was Edward's greatest revelation, that in protecting the crown, they had forgotten what it was meant to symbolize: humanity, kindness, and truth. The monarchy may endure for centuries more, but the echoes of Diana's laughter and Edward's haunting honesty will forever remind the world that even among kings and queens, there are ghosts that never truly leave the throne.